Okay, we've now got my thing to work. So history of the traffic control. Still not working properly. Okay, single push buttons. A lot of people will find some lifts still around in the world which have one button on the landing, and if you have one button on the landing, you can't do much with it, except you can. There are three things that if you have a single push button and a single car, you can just press the button, and if the lift isn't busy, then it arrives and you have control of it, often found on goods lifts. The second thing you can do is that you can press the button and it brings a car to you, and it doesn't know the direction in which you wish to travel. So if it's already got somebody in it and they're going in the wrong direction, you're going to be upset. The other thing that you can do with a single push button, single car system is you can code it to be a down collective, up distributed type system, which is often used in blocks of flats where you know that people are coming in at the ground floor, they're going to a higher floor and they're distributed, but when they want to use the lift again, it's very rare they want to go to another floor, so they simply are going down to the lobby area. The purpose of lift traffic control systems is to have inputs and outputs. And with lifts, the inputs are passenger demands, and they're either landing calls and car calls when you have buttons in both places, or we can call them hall calls when they're combined, where you simply have calls on the landing and no buttons in the car. The job of the lift controller is to allocate the landing or hall calls to a lift, and then the algorithm tells the car what to do. The passengers communicate with push buttons or keypads. So what does the traffic algorithms do that we have? Well, we've considered the single car. We can put two push buttons in there, in which case we can start to be a little bit more clever in that we know the direction in which passengers wish to travel. And so we can start to collect people in the direction that they wish to travel. And if we have more than one car, we can actually have a single riser which can communicate with both cars. The difficulty with that is that both cars will start to travel, and the one that gets there first will stop the travel of the second one. So these sort of systems were around in the 1950s and 60s, and some still are around today. There are some rules on the constraints of car movements, and we did have some discussion of that this morning when we were talking about call allocation systems with reversals. Now these rules for constraints on car movements were put down on paper by Kloss in 1970, and there are four basic rules and a fifth one. The basic rule is that a car may not stop at a floor where no passenger enters or leaves the car. It can stop there but not open the doors. A car may not pass the floor at which a passenger wishes to alight, which is defying the thing that we heard this morning. A passenger may not enter a car carrying passengers travelling in the reverse direction to the passenger's required direction of travel. Now that's down to the passenger. The passengers sometimes go in because they're not aware of the signalling system. And a car may not reverse direction of travel whilst carrying passengers, which is again is the discussion we had this morning. But once in the car, if there are car buttons there, car calls must always take precedence over landing calls. Group traffic control, which we've been talking about a lot, has a number of purposes, and there's a list of them there. Some of which are interesting, like minimising energy consumption, but most of them are trying to minimise passenger waiting times, minimise passenger journey times, and that's their purpose of group traffic control systems. Now hopefully I'm going to be able to look at a number of legacy group traffic control systems which date to the period in the 1950s and 60s. And some of these are really very extraordinary in that they were developed by using relays without the help of any electronics, relay control systems. There are four classical ones that I will talk about. The first one is a nearest car system, where the landing calls are registered and the nearest car is sent to pick up that call. There's an algorithm which detects how far the car is away from the call, and there's some rules to try and make it allocated in an optimal way by using a thing called a figure of suitability. This sort of system you used to be able to get from Thames Valley, for example. The problem with it is that the algorithm is not very sophisticated, and in this particular case we have 3 cars, one is going up, one is going down, and one is doing nothing, and the algorithm is such that this car will answer all 3 calls when we've got a car down here doing nothing, which would be helpful if it were to go and answer some of those down calls. So it's not a very clever system, but it is suitable for low-rise, small lift groups. The next thing that one can look at is static common sectors. With static common sectors, the building is divided up, usually with the same number of sectors as there are cars. Obviously one sector is at the bottom, then the remaining floors are actually allocated in some fashion. The calls that are registered in these different sectors have no concept of direction. The call is registered, a car is sent there, and the first car call will define the direction in which the lift will set off. This system was produced by Otis and was called VIP 260, and it's quite a clever system. It even knew about heavy demand, so if there's a lot of calls being registered in a particular sector, it could register those as a heavy demand and attempt to bring extra cars to that sector to serve it. The early systems didn't know about time, and so the next system which came around was the Westinghouse Mark IV, later becoming Mark V, and this was sold in the UK by the Express Lift Company. And this had 2 interesting things that it did. It didn't have common up and common down sectors. They were able to separate them out so they could be clustered together according to the type of demand expected in each of those sectors. But the interesting concept that this system had is that a timer would start as soon as the call was registered. And they had quite a complicated system of priorities, and there were 6 levels of priority, from priority 1 to priority 6. And the intention was to bring a car to a sector with the highest priority. So this was the first time that time became a parameter within the allocation algorithm. The next development that happened was one by Schindler. Schindler produced what they called a dynamic sector system. All the previous ones that we saw just now had fixed boundaries to the sectors. But what Schindler decided to do was to actually make the sector dependent on where the cars were. So we have a car going up here, so the sector would go to the next car going in the same direction. It would then continue till it came to another car going in the same direction, or an idle car, so it would stop there. And then you have another sector going round till you came back again, down to the next downgoing car, and so on. So as the cars moved around the building, the size of the sectors would change. The difficulty with that is that if you get a lot of car calls for a particular car, here it is with lots of car calls already registered, which it must take precedence over, and it's attempting to answer some of these other calls in the landing, you get one car taking too much of a share of the work. And so very cleverly, what they did was they put another sector around the top based on an empty car, a free car. Obviously you need a free car for it to work, and if there was one, then you produce this free sector thing which went round like that, went round like that, and the intention was to insert that car in the heavily demanded sector to help that sector out. And because it was dynamic sectoring, it would reduce the sector that the other car was looking at. Now, all of these things that I've just been talking about are done on bunches of relays using Boolean logic. They didn't have any programmable logic, they didn't have any computers or anything like that. And if you see any of these systems in the field, they're just masses of relays in cabinets, and of course, lots of problems with keeping relays going. Now, the modern concept was to start to use computers. And the early attempts at producing computer control were somewhat disastrous because of problems with noise getting into the electronic systems. They didn't have a very good noise immunity system and would go off and crash and all sorts of things. And I'll just mention a couple here. The estimated time of arrival, or estimated time to destination if you wish, is one system, which still forms the backbone of some of the other group control systems that you'll find in the marketplace today. Another one produced in America by a person called Halpin was the stochastic one, where the attempt was to move the call distribution away from zero. The temptation in most systems is that if anybody presses the call button and a lift is there, you serve them straight away. That means that people who have waited the least have a preference. And so the statistical distribution looks like this. What Halpin did was to move it sideways. Ideally, you would like to have the bell-type curve where the average was somewhere around here. But he didn't quite manage to do that, but he did succeed in moving it sideways. Now, the most important development that occurred is in the Hall call allocation systems. And the development of this is quite interesting historically, and this is what I want to talk about now. The history of Hall call allocation started in 1961, and it's difficult to predict the future and even harder to predict the past, but the past is important to us. Always look at the lessons of the past. The first attempt to do this was in 1961 when Laporte put in an application. Here is a copy of it, of the patent application for a call allocation system in 1961. He wrote this up eventually in a public document which seems to be published by the University of Sydney, where you know what patentry, plurality of lifts and plurality of landings, they're almost impossible to read. This one is written in language which we can understand, and that was written up in 1968. As a result of those two, the patent and the paper coming up, we became conscious of that at the University of Manchester, and Gordon David Kloss became my second PhD student at Manchester, and he was set the task that we were talking about this morning to look at the optimal way in which you could move lifts around the building. And so he did some dynamic programming to have a look at the way in which a lift could be asked to answer calls without obeying the 4 rules that I mentioned earlier. And he came to the conclusion that the best way, but not the most perfect way, of answering a set of calls was to answer them in the order that the lift passed or went to them, not to do any reversals. Having done that, the next step that happened was another student came along called Sergio Dos Santos, and he started to, it's interesting to see the opinion of Laporte, and this is a letter from Mr. McIntyre of the Lift Manufacturers Association of Australia to Bill Sturgeon, Elevator World, in 1989, where Leo is described by McIntyre as: Leo was a very vigorous individual who had definite views on most things, including his ability to revolutionize elevatoring. I met him on several occasions in the early 1970s, that's Mr. McIntyre, and whilst he apparently could be overbearing at times, he had the most attractive and cultured personality at the social level and was great fun to be with. I'm sure you know folk like that. Anyway, The result of the work of Kloss was followed on by Dos Santos, and Dos Santos and I wrote up the algorithm, the call allocation algorithm, in this 1977 book. This book was republished later as the Elevated Traffic Handbook to be able to persuade the Americans to buy it, because they don't know what a lift is. And it took a few more years before Schindler took up the idea and published in 1990 M10 as the first hall call allocation system, and put it into their buildings in Ebikon. This was done by Joris Schroeder, who unfortunately died some little while after that, not because he met me or anything, but because he wasn't very well at the time. And he was the person who first proposed, by the way, the formula for average highest reversal floor. Anyone in traffic analysis knows that Bassett-Jones produced the probable stop formula in 1923, but it took to 1955 before anybody produced the average highest floor reversal formula, and that was due to Joris Schroeder, who carried this out as part of his doctorate work at the University of Berlin. Schroeder acknowledged where he got the source for M10 as being from the 1977 book which we had written. Now, hall call allocation is very simple. You use, it's very simple I say, but you have to solve some formulae, such as these formulae here. Formulae are always put people off, and so that it can be simplified by simply optimizing this particular small amount of activity within the formula. It can be reduced to that amount. It makes it a very simple computational activity. But there are other improvements that you can make to the hall call allocation system, which is simply looking at journey time, minimizing journey time. You can do things like consider the journey time with a maximum waiting time constraint. That gives you an adaptive call allocation system. You can also do something to reduce the number of stops, and you can use dynamic subzoning. I pointed these things out to Joris Schroeder when he kindly took me to Ebikon in 1990 as a result of his paper at Elevcon. And I don't know what it was, but he said, "You do it." Well, clearly I'm not a manufacturer, so I wasn't able to do it. And even today, I don't think that all these aspects are actually included. But one of the things that you can do with the average journey time, with a maximum time constraint, you can introduce a penalty function if you have to put the allocation into a new lift rather than, it produces an allocation to a new lift, when another lift, if you just added it to that, would make a small difference to the effective waiting times and journey times of people, but not a gross effect, and therefore it conserves some of the capacity. The second thing is to reduce the number of stops by not allowing an allocation to a lift that's already stopping at a floor in the future, allocate it to that particular lift. And the most interesting one is to use dynamic up-peak subzoning. Just as we were talking this morning about hiding from the passengers exactly what is happening behind the landing doors, as it were, you can divide a building into an upper subzone and a lower subzone, and the problem is the interface is often not right for the traffic that's happening at that particular time. So the interface needs to move. So as you've got a computer there, what you can do is do a trial of adding a new core in the medium zone to the upper zone and to the lower zone, and adding it to the zone which is going to produce you the least cost. So that is the way in which you would do it. Again, you do it with a penalty function. Now, so we did some work on these to compare some of these algorithms to see how they operated. That is the classical algorithms, the legacy ones, with the hall call allocation systems. And these graphs here This is up peak, so you can use the simple collective algorithm for up peak. In other words, shoving people into the first car that they can get into, take them away, bring the car back to the landing. The dynamic sectoring with fixed sectors, the adaptive call allocation, which I'll describe in a moment, and the Hall call allocation system, and you get these results. You can see that the collective is doing quite well at these lower levels until it reaches saturation around about 80% of car capacity. The dynamic sectoring algorithm is a little bit worse. The Hall call allocation system, this one, starts bad and gradually improves and makes a tremendous difference in this area of saturation. The adaptive call allocation system is this one. And how that works is that this one is working on journey time optimization. But why do journey time optimization when there's very little load? So the idea is that you use a waiting time optimization up to the load reaches a particular level, and then switch it to journey time optimization. And basically what you're doing is you're shoving people into the first car they happen to come upon over this period, and so it's behaving more or less like a collective, and then after that you're using journey time as your criteria. Down peak performance, again we see here some classical algorithms. This is the dynamic sectoring, this is the fixed sectoring, and over Otis, this is the fixed sectoring of Westinghouse, and this is another computer algorithm which is described in the book. But you can see here that for down peak, the adaptive call allocation is winning, but not all the time. You can see that the fixed sectoring system, due to Westinghouse, works extremely well at these high levels of demand. So again, some of the legacy systems can produce better results than you might expect to get by some of the modern systems. The interfloor traffic one, here you can see again the same performance for the legacy systems here, a computer-based system, and in this case adaptive call allocation, where you can see that the performance is widening up here, but these levels of load in a system are extremely high. It's very unlikely in an interfloor situation that you would in fact exceed this particular level. Now I always like to finish off with a quotation from Douglas Adams, which I did when Richard was professorialized. I always like to quote it because it's in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Actually it's a restaurant at the end of the universe, and he wrote this in 1980 with a great deal of perception, because he said that modern elevators are strange and complex entities. This is because they operate on the curious principle of defocused temporal perception, and Richard is working on that as we speak. In other words, they have the capacity to see dimly into the immediate future, which enables the elevator to be on the right floor to pick you up even before you knew you wanted it, thus eliminating all the tedious chatting, relaxing and making friends that people were forced to do whilst waiting for elevators. We can all see into the future. It's part of our programming. And there you are. That's the People's Hall which Nick was talking about earlier. Thank you very much for listening to me.